In the courtyard at the entrance to the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, there is a mosque, the Nur-u Osmaniye, completed in 1755. It is an Ottoman imperial mosque in the grand tradition, a single dome over a wide lateral extension of space, at first sight much resembling its predecessors, the great cathedral mosques of Mehmet the Conqueror, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the rest. But there is one rather interesting difference, and that is the Italian Baroque influence in the minor decoration and details. When a foreign influence appears in something as central to a culture as an imperial foundation and a cathedral mosque, there is clearly some faltering of cultural self-confidence. Something is happening, something important. If we compare the pace and extent of cultural changes in literature, music, and the visual arts, we must be struck by the fact that the third is far older, goes back for far longer, and is in every way pervasive and more successful than the first two. The translation of works of European literature, as distinct from books containing what was deemed to be useful information, began on a very limited scale in the early 19th century, and did not reach significant proportions until the latter part of the century. In the 20th century, the trickle became a torrent, and Arabic, Persian, and Turkish literature were all transformed under the impact, developing new forms and moving in new directions. The attempt to introduce European music seems to have begun in about 1830, when Sultan Mahmud II, as part of his military reforms, imported a bandmaster from Italy and entrusted him with the task of forming, training, and conducting an Ottoman military band. But the importation of Western musical notions and patterns encountered far greater resistance, and apart from national anthems and other military marches, it has only a very limited appeal even to the present day. The introduction of European art, in contrast, is a success story. A prized possession of the National Gallery in London is a portrait of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople, by the Italian artist Gentile Bellini. The painting is in London, not in Istanbul, because Sultan Mehmet's successor, the more pious Sultan Bayezid, disapproved of portraits and disposed of his father's collection. In principle, of course, Muslim law, as commonly interpreted and applied, prohibited portraiture, and as late as 1721, an Ottoman ambassador to France, 28 Çelebi Mehmet Efendi, noted in his report, I quote, "The custom among these people is that the king gives ambassadors his own portrait adorned with diamonds. But since pictures are not permitted among Muslims, I was given instead," and then the ambassador goes on to enumerate in loving detail the sumptuous gifts which were given to him. Similarly, his description of the paintings which he saw in the palace at Versailles is perfunctory and dismissive, in contrast with his detailed and appreciative account of French tapestries, a familiar and therefore accessible art form. But Mehmet the Conqueror was neither the first nor the last Muslim ruler to indulge himself in this way. The Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay is reported to have had his portrait painted by a European artist. Later it became quite usual among Middle Eastern monarchs to bring in Western, mostly Italian artists. In time, we find local artists, some of them trained in Europe, painting portraits. Painting a portrait was obviously a new and radical departure in the cultural traditions of a region which has a very rich and distinctive artistic tradition of its own. The Italian architect who helped design the Nur-u Osmaniye Mosque, almost 40 years before the reforms of Selim III, was by no means the first. He and his employers already had some experience on which to build. Western influences can be seen at quite an early date, even as far east as Iran, where miniature art shows awareness of European ideas and practices. European prints were widely distributed. We find them, for example, in the inventories of the possessions of deceased persons, which were drawn up in order to comply with the inheritance laws of Islam and preserved in the Ottoman archives. By the 18th century, many of these inventories include European prints of one sort or another. Some were fortresses and may have been acquired for purposes of military intelligence, but by no means all of them, and the influence of European art is clearly divisible in local productions. We even hear of an artist with the odd name of Paolo Zaman. Apparently originally from Iran, he studied in Italy, returned to Iran, and at some stage seems to have become a Catholic, whence the Paolo. Western architectural influence becomes very clear, both in the structure and in the interior decoration of buildings. By the 19th century, it is almost universal. The older artistic and architectural traditions were dying and being replaced by this new art from Europe. Visual westernization can be seen in a number of ways. We see it, for example, in practical matters, coins and stamps. There have been coins in the Middle East for a very long time. Now they looked different. European usage in the form of royal portraits, outrage according to traditional Muslim ideas, shows the degree of cultural penetration. Stamps were, of course, entirely new. The stamp was itself a Western innovation, but still more so, the form of the stamp, whom it portrays, what it depicts. One of the attractions of European art, and especially of portraiture, must have been the artist's use of perspective, which made possible a kind of realism and accuracy very different from the formal, stylized art of the traditional miniature. Portraits were realistic likenesses that had an obvious attraction. Before very long, they also proved useful for monarchs and others who could afford to pay for them and knew how to use them. Portraits were bad enough. Far worse, from a traditional Muslim point of view, was the introduction of statues. The Sultan Palace in Tehran has or had on display busts of Muhammad Shah, who reigned from 1834 to 1848, and Nasr-ad-Din Shah, reigned 1848 to 1896, by an Italian and a French sculptor, respectively. The first publicly displayed statues appeared to have been commissioned by Ismail Pasha, later Khedive of Egypt, of his father and grandfather, Ibrahim Pasha and Muhammad Ali Pasha. These were brought from France to be erected, the one in the Ezbekiya Square in Cairo, the other in Alexandria. They were unveiled in 1873. Other statues were made, but few were publicly displayed before the 20th century, when the practice became usual. The attack on this practice, seen as an idolatrous cult of secularist and therefore anti-Muslim reformers, is a common theme of fundamentalist argument and sometimes action. Dress also shows the influence of Western visual conceptions. Clothes, of course, serve a double purpose: to keep out the cold and the damp, and to preserve decency. The second of these may be developed as a recognition signal to indicate identity. When people change the clothes that they wear and adopt the clothes and with them the notions of decency of another society, this represents a significant cultural choice. At various times and places in the modern Middle East, vestimentary reform was both adopted and resisted as such. The clothing reform began with the armies and is vividly depicted in two portraits of Sultan Mahmud II before and after the destruction of the Janissaries in 1826. In the first, the Sultan, his aide, even his horse, wear traditional dress and accoutrements. In the second, all three have been westernized. In every other respect, the pictures are identical. Today, almost all Middle Eastern armies wear uniforms of Western pattern. Even the soldiers of Libya and the Islamic Republic of Iran still wear Western-type uniforms, just as they use Western-type weapons. Weapons are a military necessity. Uniforms are, at least in some degree, a cultural choice. One might almost say a cultural submission. Shoes and hats are particularly important. Shoes were seen by many Western travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries as one of the key distinctions between Middle Eastern and Western habits. When someone is being westernized, or in Middle Eastern terms, is becoming Frankish in his habits, the wearing of leather shoes or boots acquires an almost emblematic quality. The supreme emblem is, of course, the headgear, which can indicate religion, allegiance, and sometimes occupation, and crowns the wearer even in death, as the carved headstones in an old-style cemetery attest. The adoption of headgear with a brim or peak was not only non-Islamic, but also, since such a head covering would interfere with Muslim worship, in a sense anti-Islamic, and has been both imposed and resisted as such. In Turkish, the phrase şapka giymek, to put on a hat, acquired much the same meaning as the English to turn one's coat. That's to say, to go over to the other side. It no longer has that meaning at the present day. The change in dress also raises the uniquely Western conception of fashion. The idea that last year's model is no longer acceptable this year, that from time to time one changes what one wears, or by extension what one says or even thinks, in order to conform to some kind of movable standard. An Egyptian sheikh who lived in Paris between 1826 and 1831 and wrote an account of what he had seen, explained it to his readers in this way, I quote, "One of the characteristics of the French is their curiosity and avid desire for novelties, and their love of change in everything, and especially in dress. Nothing is ever permanent with them. This does not mean that they change their dress entirely, only that they vary it. For example, they would not stop wearing the hat and wrap their heads in a turban, but sometimes they wear a hat of one shape and then to another shape or color." The use of clothing, particularly but not exclusively headgear, as a recognition symbol, has another important indirect consequence. In the traditional Islamic order, there were three groups of people who were subject to legal inequalities of status, specified by law and imposed and enforced by the public authorities: women, slaves, and unbelievers. All three were inferior to free male Muslims, and in order that there should be no misunderstanding, they were expected to dress differently and look different. The legal abolition of some of these inferiorities was an important aspect of what one might call the modernization of clothing. The veiling, unveiling, and reveiling of women has indeed been a major theme in the revolutions and counter-revolutions of our time. The visual impact of westernization was vastly increased by the introduction of photography, and accelerated by that other imported device, the printing press. As with other European innovations, photography in the Middle East was at first mainly in the hands of foreigners, then of members of religious minorities, finally of the majority cultures. Armenian photographers in particular played a major role in the development of photography, both as an art and as a business, in the Ottoman lands. At first, it was these two aspects, art and business, that were the main concerns of both the producers and consumers of photographic pictures. By the introduction of the postal system and of the newspaper press in the course of the 19th century, vastly increased the circulation and the impact of pictures, overwhelmingly of Western origin or inspiration. A notable innovation was the picture postcard, bringing images of places and people and a message that these could convey to recipients all over the world. Sultan Abdul Hamid was an avid collector of picture postcards. His collection can be seen in the Istanbul University Library. Many of the Sultan's photographs were made to order and were used as propaganda to demonstrate the progress and modernization of the Ottoman Empire. In 1893, he had them assembled in a set of 58 albums, Morocco-bound and gold-tooled, and sent copies with the Sultan's compliments to the Queen of England, the Emperor of Germany, and the Presidents of France and the United States. The collection emphasizes photographs of industrial developments and military installations, roads and bridges, schools and hospitals, and was clearly intended to show a different face of the Middle East from the familiar portrayals of exotically clad men, veiled or unclad women, and picturesque and mostly primitive places. Even greater was the impact of the newly created newspaper press. Journalists and editors soon learnt the value of pictures, with their immediate appeal and direct impact. Pictures, it is said, speak louder than words. This is especially true in a society with a low level of literacy. Until quite recently, it was a common sight to see the one literate member of a circle reading the newspaper aloud to his friends. Showing them a picture was quicker and more directly effective. Middle Eastern editors soon learned to use another European innovation, the cartoon. Probably the first cartoon in the Middle East was published in the Turkish newspaper Istanbul in 1867. The first in the Arabic press was probably one published in 1887 in an Egyptian humorous and satirical newspaper. Thereafter, the political cartoon, quickly and cheaply reproduced, became a major instrument of propaganda all over the region. Visual modernization enters a new phase with the introduction of the cinema and still more of television. But that is another story. Thank you.